March 3rd, 1954, 11:14 in the morning. A courier walked into the Federal Reserve Bank of New York carrying a single leather folder, and inside that folder was an application that 11 different attorneys had told Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson could never be approved. Not because the paperwork was wrong, because the applicant was black, and in 1954, the federal banking system had never once, not a single time in its history, chartered a new bank owned and controlled by a black man in the state of New York. 6 months later, that same man would stand in the doorway of his own bank, watching a line of customers stretch around 3 city blocks. Customers the entire financial establishment of Manhattan had spent decades training to believe they didn't deserve a signature on a deposit slip. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson didn't just fight the banks that locked Harlem out. He built the one that let it in. To understand how a numbers runner from Charleston, South Carolina, ended up holding a federal charter, you have to go back to the winter before, to a night that had nothing to do with money at all. It was January of 1954, and Bumpy sat in his usual corner booth at the Cotton Club, half listening to the band, half listening to the room the way he always did. That was his gift. Other men heard music, Bumpy heard information, and that night, 2 tables over, he heard something that would occupy his mind for the next year of his life. A woman named Odessa Marsh was crying, quietly, trying not to be seen doing it, while her husband patted her hand and told her it would be all right. Bumpy didn't approach. He never approached. He sent his associate, a quiet, careful man named Elijah Turner, to buy their next round and sit a while. What Elijah came back with wasn't gossip. It was a number 9. Odessa Marsh had been turned down for a small business loan 9 times in 11 months. She wanted $600 to buy a commercial sewing machine so she could take in tailoring work faster than her hands alone could manage. $600. Her husband made steady wages at the rail yard. They had no debts, no arrests, no black marks anywhere on paper. 9 banks said no. Not one of them wrote down the real reason. They didn't have to. Everyone in that booth already knew it. Bumpy had heard versions of this story 100 times before. What made this one different was timing, because 3 weeks earlier, a different conversation, a colder one, had reached him through a very different channel. A city councilman named Everett Bradley had been overheard at a private club downtown telling a group of businessmen that Harlem's loan applications were being denied at a rate 11 times higher than identical. Applications from white neighborhoods with the exact same income levels. He hadn't said it as an accusation. He'd said it as a strategy. Keep the community dependent. Keep the capital moving south to lenders who charge 4 times prime. And everyone at that table gets rich twice, once on the interest, once on the property they'd eventually foreclose on when the debt became unmanageable. Bumpy had built an empire on understanding leverage. He understood, listening to Elijah recount that overheard conversation word for word, that Harlem wasn't being punished, it was being farmed. He called Marcus Vance the next morning. Marcus had graduated from Howard University with a degree in economics in 1948 and had spent 6 years since then doing bookkeeping for 3 different Harlem businesses because no accounting firm in Manhattan would put a black man's name on their letterhead, no matter how clean his numbers were. Bumpy had known Marcus's father for 20 years. He trusted the son's mind the way he trusted very few men's judgment. "I need you to find out something for me," Bumpy told him over the phone. "Not gossip, numbers. I want to know exactly how a bank gets chartered in this country. Not the version they teach in school, the real version. Every law, every loophole, every requirement, every regulator who has to sign off." Marcus asked the obvious question, Why? Because I'm done asking men who hate me for permission to exist in their buildings, Bumpy said. I'm going to build my own building. For the next 4 months, Marcus Vance disappeared into law libraries and federal registers most people didn't know existed. What he found was that the law itself wasn't the obstacle. Under the Federal Deposit Insurance Act, any group of qualified individuals could apply for a national bank charter provided they met capital requirements, demonstrated sound management, and could prove the institution would serve a genuine banking need in its community. Nowhere in that federal code was there a single word about race. The obstacle wasn't the law. The obstacle was every human being sitting between Bumpy Johnson and the men who enforced it. That was the first thing Bumpy learned building his bank. The rules were fair. The referees weren't, and a man who understood that difference had already found his opening. The minimum capital requirement for a national bank charter in a city the size of New York was $200,000, a figure calculated specifically to keep the door closed to anyone without generational wealth behind them. Bumpy had access to more than that through his existing operations, but he understood something Marcus's research confirmed in black and white. If the money looked like it came from numbers running from the very rackets that had built his reputation in Harlem, the controller of the currency would deny the application on character grounds before anyone even looked at the balance sheet. Dirty money, no matter how much of it there was, would sink the entire project before it began. So Bumpy did something almost nobody expected from him. He spent 8 months quietly converting the appearance of his fortune, real estate holdings under legitimate corporate names, a laundromat chain that actually turned a profit on its own merits, a small chain of Harlem barbershops and restaurants that had always been legal but had never been documented as carefully as they suddenly were now. Every transaction logged, every tax filing pristine, every dollar traceable to a source that any federal examiner could look at and find nothing but an unusually successful Harlem businessman. His lawyer at the time, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Walter Prescott, one of only 4 black attorneys admitted to the New York bar with any standing in commercial law, told him plainly what they were up against. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "they are not going to deny you because your money is dirty. They are going to try to deny you because you exist. We have to make it impossible for them to say so out loud." That meant building a board. A national bank charter required named directors, officers, and a demonstration of management competence that regulators could evaluate on paper without ever meeting the applicants in person, at least not at first. Bumpy assembled 5 people over the following months, and every single one of them was chosen the way a general chooses which unit takes which hill. Marcus Vance would serve as the bank's chief financial officer. His Howard degree and 6 years of flawless bookkeeping finally given a stage worthy of his mind. Eleanor Whitfield, a retired schoolteacher who had spent 30 years managing the finances of 3 different Harlem churches without ever losing a dollar or missing a filing, would serve as a director. Her reputation for honesty so absolute that even white clergy across the river vouched for her without being asked. A Jewish garment manufacturer named Sol Bernstein, whose own father had been turned away from 3 Manhattan banks in 1911 for the crime of being an immigrant, agreed to lend his name and a modest capital contribution as a director, partly out of principle, partly because he recognized in Bumpy's plan the same door he wished had been open for his own father 40 years earlier. And a decorated Army veteran named Corporal James Ainsley, who had lost his left hand at Anzio and come home to discover that his Purple Heart didn't buy him a business loan any more than his skin color allowed one, rounded out the founding board, his war record a piece of moral armor that Bumpy knew the Comptroller's office would find very difficult to publicly disrespect. Every name on that application had been chosen because their record made the objection unspeakable. Nobody wanted to be the federal official who denied a war hero, a widowed schoolteacher, and an immigrant's son a banking license on the grounds that the fifth man in the room had grown up poor in Harlem. That was the trap Bumpy built before he ever walked through a single door. He didn't hide his own name. He surrounded it with names the system couldn't afford to insult in public. But building an unimpeachable board only solved half the problem, and Bumpy knew it. Capital and character were the visible tests. The invisible test, the one nobody wrote down anywhere, was whether the existing banks of Manhattan would allow a new competitor into their world at all. That resistance arrived exactly the way Bumpy expected it to, quietly, through channels designed never to leave fingerprints. In May of 1954, the application for what Bumpy had named the Harlem Provident Trust Company reached the desk of a regional bank examiner named Franklin Doyle, a mid-level federal official whose entire career had been built on never causing waves. Doyle didn't reject the application outright. That would have required a reason, and reasons could be appealed. Walter Prescott, the lawyer, recognized the pattern immediately, because he had watched it destroy a dozen other Harlem business applications over the years, none of which had ever had the resources to fight back. "This is how they kill you without a decision," he told Bumpy. "They don't say no. They just make sure yes never arrives." Most applicants gave up at this stage. Most applicants didn't have what Bumpy had spent 20 years building, which was a network of eyes and ears in nearly every building of consequence in New York City, including, as it happened, the federal examiner's own office building, where a cleaning supervisor named Otis Grimes had worked the night shift for 11 years and had quietly, loyally, kept Bumpy informed of small things in that building for most of that time, expecting nothing in return but the knowledge that his rent had somehow never once been late, even in years. The rail yard cut his hours. Otis mentioned, almost in passing, that Franklin Doyle kept a second set of ledgers in his bottom desk drawer. Personal ones, tracking a string of small cash gifts from 3 different downtown banking executives whose applications he had processed with unusual speed over the previous 2 years. Doyle wasn't a genius villain. He was a small, frightened man taking small, frightened bribes to keep 3 larger, wealthier competitors free of any inconvenient new banks in neighborhoods those competitors had already decided to keep dependent forever. Bumpy didn't threaten Franklin Doyle. He didn't have to, and threats left marks that lawyers could later use against him. Instead, Walter Prescott requested, through entirely proper legal channels, an official inquiry into processing delays on a fully compliant federal charter application, citing the specific federal statute requiring timely review, and attaching, almost as an afterthought, a notarized affidavit from a night-cleaning employee describing personal financial records he had observed in a federal office during the routine performance of his duties. Franklin Doyle's superiors did not want a scandal. They wanted this problem to disappear as quickly and quietly as it had been created. 3 days after that affidavit reached the regional director's desk, the application for Harlem Provident Trust Company was found, fully intact, all signatures present, and moved to what the letter called expedited final review. That was the first micro-victory, and Bumpy knew better than to celebrate it, because the men who had been paying Franklin Doyle for 2 years to keep Harlem locked out of banking hadn't been acting alone, and Marcus Vance's research had already told them exactly who those men worked for. The 5 largest banks in Manhattan had, for decades, operated under what industry insiders called a gentleman's understanding, an informal, unwritten agreement never to compete for the same underserved neighborhoods. which in practice meant simply refusing those neighborhoods service altogether rather than risk one institution, gaining an advantage by finally saying yes. It wasn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of secret meetings and blood oaths. It was worse than that. It was so normal, so baked into daily practice, that none of the men enforcing it even thought of themselves as doing anything wrong. When word reached those 5 institutions that a new, federally compliant bank was about to open in Harlem under the direction of men whose paperwork was impossible to challenge, the response came not as a legal objection, but as a private visit. 2 men arrived at Bumpy's office above the club on a Tuesday afternoon in July, dressed in the kind of tailoring that cost more than most of their potential customers made in a year. They introduced themselves as representing a consortium of downtown financial interests, and they came, they said, in a spirit of cooperation. Mr. Johnson, the older of the 2, said, "We understand you're a man of considerable business acumen, and we respect that. We'd like to propose an alternative. Rather than open a competing institution, our consortium would be prepared to fund, generously, a community loan program administered through existing banks. Grants, interest lending, the kind of goodwill gesture that would benefit the entire neighborhood without the considerable overhead and risk of maintaining an independent charter." Bumpy let the offer sit in the air a moment before he answered, because he had learned decades earlier that silence made desperate men reveal more than questions ever could. "That's generous," he finally said. "Tell me something. This community loan program, who decides who qualifies?" The younger man answered too quickly, the way men do when they haven't rehearsed the honest version of an answer. "Well, naturally, the participating institutions would maintain standard underwriting criteria." "The same standard underwriting criteria," Bumpy said, "that turned down Odessa Marsh 9 times for $600 to buy a sewing machine." Neither man had an answer for that, because there wasn't one that didn't expose the entire arrangement for what it actually was. A way of keeping the money moving through the same hands it had always moved through, dressed up in new language. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, standing to signal the meeting was over, "I don't need your charity. I have a charter application that will be approved within the year, with or without your goodwill. I only invited you to finish this sentence because I wanted to hear you say it yourselves, and now I have." That was, in fact, an exaggeration. The application was not, at that point, guaranteed to be approved at all. But Bumpy Johnson had spent his entire life understanding that a bluff spoken with total conviction was worth more than the truth spoken with hesitation. And the 2 men walking out of his office that afternoon left convinced they were dealing with a man already holding better cards than they were. They were not entirely wrong to worry, because 3 weeks after that meeting, Franklin Doyle's superiors, perhaps sensing which direction the wind was now blowing, perhaps simply tired of a problem that kept generating uncomfortable paperwork, approved the preliminary charter for Harlem Provident Trust Company, pending a final capital verification and a standard character review of its officers. The character review was where the entire year of careful, patient construction was tested hardest, because it was the one part of the process where a federal examiner could still legally look directly at Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's history and decide he did not meet the moral standard required to operate a federally insured institution. The examiner assigned to the final character review was a woman named Constance Pemberton, and she had a reputation, even among her own colleagues, for being incorruptible in a way that made her either deeply respected or deeply feared, depending on which side of a decision you sat on. She had turned down bribes from applicants twice her salary. She had also, on 2 prior occasions in her career, denied fully qualified minority applicants on character grounds so thin that even her own supervisors, privately, admitted the denials had been unnecessary, though never publicly. Walter Prescott warned Bumpy the night before her scheduled visit to the bank's proposed offices on 125th Street. "She is not like Doyle," he said. "You cannot embarrass her into compliance. She does not take money, and she does not fear scandal, because she has never done anything a scandal could attach to. If she decides you are not fit to hold this charter, there will be no leverage, no affidavit, no clever maneuver that changes her mind. She will simply write the word denied, and it will be final." Bumpy spent that night doing something he rarely did before a confrontation. He prepared no leverage at all. He gathered no photographs, no recordings, no manila envelope thick with somebody's secrets. For the first time in the entire project, he understood that the only weapon that would work in that room was the truth itself, delivered without performance. Constance Pemberton arrived at 9 in the morning, alone, carrying a single briefcase, and spent 4 hours going through every ledger, every director's biography, every capital document Marcus Vance had prepared, asking questions in a flat, unhurried voice that gave away nothing about which way she was leaning. At the end of those 4 hours, she set down her pen and looked directly at Bumpy Johnson for the first time since walking through the door. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I am aware of your reputation. I am aware that men in this city speak your name the way they speak the names of men they are afraid of. I have spent this morning looking for a reason your reputation disqualifies you from this charter, and I want you to understand that I looked very hard, because it is my job to look hard." Bumpy said nothing. He had learned that the worst thing a man could do when a judge was thinking out loud was interrupt her. "What I found," Constance Pemberton continued, "is a board of directors whose collective record is more spotless than half the boards I approve in a given year. A capital structure that is not only compliant but conservative, and a stated purpose, serving a documented, undeniable gap in lending to a specific population within federal jurisdiction. That is, frankly, Mr. Johnson, exactly what this charter process was designed to encourage. Whatever certain people downtown might prefer it be used for instead." She closed her folder. "I am recommending approval," she said, "not because of who you are, because of what is on this paper. If you were half the man your reputation claims, this application would have collapsed the moment I opened it. It did not. The federal charter for Harlem Provident Trust Company was formally granted on the 4th of October, 1954. Bumpy Johnson read the approval letter twice, alone in his office, before he allowed himself to feel anything about it at all, because 20 years in the most dangerous streets in America had taught him that the moment a man celebrates, too early is the moment his enemies find their opening. He was right to be careful. The 5-bank consortium that had tried to buy him off in July had not given up. They had simply changed strategy, and their new strategy arrived exactly 9 days before the bank's scheduled opening, in the form of a story planted in a downtown financial newsletter with a small but influential readership among the city's business elite. The story alleged, without naming a single verifiable source, that the new Harlem institution was, in fact, a front for organized numbers-running operations designed to launder illegal gambling proceeds through a legitimate federal charter. It cited no documents. It named no witnesses. It didn't need to. It only needed to exist long enough to reach the desk of the same regional banking authority that had just approved the charter, giving them a face-saving excuse to reopen the entire review under the guise of protecting the public. Bumpy understood immediately what was happening, because he had used similar tools himself against men who deserved it far more than he did. Somebody was trying to kill his bank with a rumor instead of a rejection, because a rejection could be appealed and a rumor could not. This was where the year of quiet, boring, meticulous legitimacy paid its full dividend. Marcus Vance did not panic. He simply opened the bank's books, every single one of them, voluntarily, to the same regional authority, along with 2 years of independently audited tax. Filings for every legitimate business Bumpy owned. Filings so clean and so thoroughly documented that the newsletter's anonymous allegation collapsed the moment anyone with actual authority looked at it for more than 5 minutes. Constance Pemberton, who by now had staked her own professional judgment on this approval, was the one who ultimately closed the matter, informing the newsletter's publisher in a brief, icy letter that any further publication of unverified claims against a federally chartered institution would be treated as a matter for her office's own review. A threat that, coming from a woman with her reputation, ended the story permanently within the week. Harlem Provident Trust Company opened its doors on the morning of November the 15th, 1954, in a modest but dignified building on 125th Street that Bumpy had personally walked through 6 times during renovation, insisting on details most owners never thought to. Consider wider chairs for older customers, a coat check so no one waiting in line had to stand in winter weather, tellers trained specifically never to ask a customer to repeat themselves if their accent made a word unclear the first time. The first customer through the door that morning was Odessa Marsh, the woman whose tears in a nightclub booth 10 months earlier had started the entire chain of events, carrying an application for a $600 loan to purchase a commercial sewing machine. It was approved in 11 minutes. Behind her stood a line that would eventually stretch past 3 city blocks by early afternoon. A line made up of exactly the customers the 5 downtown banks had spent decades training themselves to overlook. Domestic workers, rail yard laborers, small shopkeepers, war veterans, widows, immigrants whose accents had cost them service at 3 other institutions. Every single one of them carrying the quiet, unglamorous paperwork of an ordinary life that had simply never been allowed anywhere near a bank before. Bumpy stood near the entrance most of that first day, not behind a desk, not giving speeches, mostly just watching the way he always watched, cataloguing faces, remembering names, understanding that the true measure of what he had built would not be visible for years, not in headlines, but in how many of those faces came back a decade later owning the buildings they currently rented, sending children to colleges their own parents had never been allowed to imagine. The 5-bank consortium made one final attempt roughly 8 months later, when their earlier offer of a charitable loan program had obviously failed to slow Harlem Provident Trust's growth. 2 representatives returned, this time with a considerably larger number attached to a buyout offer, framed once again as a partnership, an acquisition that would fold the young bank's assets and customer base quietly into one of the larger downtown institutions in exchange for a payment that would have made every founding director independently wealthy. Bumpy listened to the entire offer without interrupting, the way he always did, and then walked to his office window, looking down at a street that no longer had a line stretching around it because by then Harlem Provident Trust had opened enough branches that the wait had shortened to 20 minutes on a busy Saturday. "Gentlemen," he said without turning round, "you keep coming back to this office thinking this was always a business decision. It never was. You built a system that decided an entire neighborhood didn't deserve a signature on a deposit slip. I didn't build a bank to compete with you. I built it to prove that decision was a lie. You can't buy back a lie once somebody's already shown everyone what the truth looks like. The offer was declined, and it was the last one the consortium ever made. By 1958, Harlem Provident Trust Company had financed the purchase of over 400 homes for families who had been redlined out of every other institution in the city. It had provided small business loans that helped launch 24 shops still standing on 125th Street A. Full decade later, Marcus Vance, the young Howard graduate who had once done bookkeeping in back rooms because no firm would put his name on a letterhead, eventually became one of the most respected bank executives in New York City. His early career at Harlem Provident cited 4 years afterward in economics programs studying community lending models. Franklin Doyle, the small, frightened examiner who had buried the application twice, was quietly reassigned to a regional office in a different state within a year, his career never recovering the trajectory it once had, though he was never publicly charged with anything at all, which was, in its own way, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous ending Bumpy Johnson had always preferred to deliver. The kind that ended a man's influence without ever making him a martyr. Constance Pemberton went on to review dozens more minority-owned bank applications over the following decade, and colleagues later said she had grown noticeably less willing to accept thin objections after 1954, though she never once, in any recorded interview, mentioned the Harlem case by name. She didn't need to. Everyone who worked with her understood exactly which morning had changed her calculus. Odessa Marsh's tailoring business grew steadily for the rest of her life, and she banked at the same branch on 125th Street until the day she died, telling anyone who asked that she still had the original sewing machine, the one that 11 minutes and one small loan had finally made possible. Years later, when a young journalist asked Bumpy Johnson to explain how he had managed to build a legitimate, federally chartered bank in an era when the entire financial system had been engineered specifically to prevent exactly that, his answer became one of the few quotes attributed to him that made it, largely unaltered, into print. "They told me a black man could never own a bank in this city," he said. "They were right about one thing. It had never happened. So I stopped asking whether it could happen, and I started building the paperwork that proved it already had." The line outside Harlem Provident Trust Company never fully disappeared. It simply changed shape over the years, shorter on quiet Tuesdays, longer at the start of every month, a permanent, living monument to the exact moment an entire system of exclusion had been answered not with a riot, not with a protest, but with a folder full of flawless paperwork and a patience that outlasted every man who had tried to bury it. Some victories are loud enough to make headlines. This one was quiet enough to make history instead, one deposit slip at a time, for the rest of the 20th century.